Hey there. I was just sitting here at my breakfast table and pondering the definition of art. And I was looking at some pictures that I came across, and I came across this picture that my husband took of me at the Pompidou Center in Paris a few years back. And as you can see, I'm pretending to make a shocked face as I gaze upon Marcel Duchamp's infamous sculpture called Fountain, produced in 1917. In this video, I'm going to address just why this work was so shocking and why 100 years later it continues to drive us crazy and poke holes at our definitions of art. So, let's go. Okay, so in 1917, Marcel Duchamp, a French painter, entered this sculpture in an exhibition put on by the edgy Society of Independent Artists and waited for it to be rejected. He didn't make the urinal, he simply chose it, flipped it upside down, and in doing so, flipped the art world upside down along with it. He signed the work Art, referencing a plumbing manufacturing company as well as the name of a cartoon strip. Duchamp liked to use puns and push the envelope, and so some of his rebellious work, like Fountain, can be seen as a stick-it-to-the-man kind of response to Western ideals. At the time he produced Fountain, Europe was smack dab in the middle of World War I. And so the world as he knew it had been overturned and was going down the toilet. And so you can see that there's some significant historical context that frames our understanding of the work. But what I want to get to in this discussion are the questions that this piece raises about what counts as art. This work pokes holes at historic definitions of the word art, and it demonstrates all of the problems that Duchamp was finding with those historical definitions. Okay, so problem number one that Duchamp addresses is beauty. Our first gut level reaction to this work when we realize it's a urinal is, ew, gross. And there's a reason that he chose a urinal. He wanted to choose an object that automatically triggers disgust, and in doing so, raises the important question, must you like something for it to be art? And what about works that are ugly and disgusting? Does that fact disqualify them? I think most of us would admit, okay, no, because we can see the importance of art being able to speak into the realities of our human existence. Life is not always beautiful and pleasant. Sometimes life is cruel and unfair and painful and sometimes terrifying. And so there are times when we need truthful art to help us sort through these emotions as well. Here are a few examples of works that I find particularly gross or terrifying, but they were all coming from real places of pain and angst. And although no one would say that they're necessarily pleasant or beautiful, we wouldn't say that this fact disqualifies them as art. Another problem that Duchamp raises with our definition of art is the concept of time and craftsmanship. He didn't make the urinal himself, and the alterations he added didn't take much time. And I think this is one of the greatest frustrations that people have with this work, myself included. So just how much technique and skill is required for something to be counted as art? I can spend 80 hours making a single painting, but are my 2-minute sketches considered art? Or what about the art of an untrained child? Is there a line in the sand between art and non-art when it comes to skill level or the time invested? A third problem he raises is about the concept. How much expression and thought is required? Can a simple idea be considered art? Here's another ready-made he produced involving a snow shovel. And here it is hovering over my husband's head at the Pompidou. Duchamp forces us to consider, how much does that work have to communicate? And can that work be open to interpretation and its meaning be left to the eye of the beholder? Another problem that Duchamp raises in his works is the idea of intent. Can art be accidental? How much planning and involvement is required on the part of the artist, and how much can be left up to chance? This is a work that Duchamp made on a large piece of glass, and when the glass broke in shipment, he actually embraced that fact. He viewed the accident as part of the work as well. Artists know that one's intent is often surrendered in the creative process. As Bob Ross famously says, there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. This leads me to another problem that Duchamp addresses, and that is the idea of location and origin. Where does an art object end and where does it begin? Is Duchamp's fountain just an upside-down urinal? Or should the consideration of this work also include the myriads of conversations it provoked, its cultural context, its significance in art history, its artistic influence, and this video itself? Which gets me thinking of another question when it comes to the definition of art, and that concerns audience. What role does the audience play with what we deem as art? And must there even be an audience for something to be considered art? Instead of the question, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? What about the question, if an artist creates a work of art, but no one ever sees it, is it still considered art? I think about James Hampton, who worked as a janitor, but then secretly built this large assemblage of religious art from all these scavenged materials like aluminum and cardboard. And he spent 14 years putting together 180 objects in his garage as this monument to Jesus. Now, his art was not discovered until after his death, when the owner of the property came into the garage to check on rent and then discovered all that he had created. The discovery attracted a lot of attention, and it was eventually acquired by the Smithsonian Art Museum, where it's currently exhibited. I think something that is admired about Hampton's work is that it's special and unique, even if it was created in secret. And that brings me to another problem that Duchamp addresses in this work, and that concerns originality. A common frustration with this piece is that it's not special. It's a urinal. And for, I guess, at least half the population, it's something that they see every day. And so it begs the question of how unique must a work be for it to be considered art? And this is a question that is actually asked again and again throughout the 20th century. 4 decades after Duchamp raises this question, Andy Warhol asks it again by raising up everyday items like Campbell's soup and Coca-Cola, to the status of fine art, and asks for these everyday items, these common items, to be reconsidered. In fact, Andy Warhol, he purposefully chose screen printing as his technique because he was able to replicate the kind of factory-like settings of these mass-produced items. He also preferred screen print because it was a technique that didn't require him to physically touch the artwork. Now, I think one could argue that the more unique an object is, the greater its value, but this applies to things even outside the art world. Basic economics demonstrates that the more limited the quantity, the greater the value. So can originality be a determinant when it comes to what counts as art and what doesn't? A final issue to address is authorship. Some people might say, okay, I'll concede that this ceramic object is art, but I'm not willing to say that Duchamp is the artist. He didn't make it with his own hands. Some poor worker in the factory made that. And so the real artist is that factory worker. So it begs the question, who should get credit for this work? And how much involvement is required for an artist to receive attribution? Here's an entire room in the Louvre of the famous Marie de Medici cycle that's attributed to Peter Paul Rubens. So Rubens is credited as the artist of these works, but he certainly didn't create each work by himself. In fact, he had a large workshop with many apprentices, and although he may have designed the compositions and painted the hands and the faces, he certainly would have had help with the backgrounds, the clothes, and so forth. In fact, this was standard practice for many artists throughout history. When it comes to artists and architects, we are constantly crediting those with the idea and the vision over those who just merely execute that vision. One might even argue that animals have the facility to execute just simple artistic tasks. So when it comes to more conceptual expressions, it's the artist's unique vision that warrants the attribution. Louise Norton actually addressed the thorny issue of authorship in the midst of Fountain's controversy by stating, "Whether he made it with his own hands has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and created a new thought for that object." And so Duchamp creates these works to poke holes at our beloved standards. And the questions that he raises, they continue to agitate us to this day. And, as annoyed as we get with works like Fountain, I do think there is value in actually noticing what we are reacting or responding against. If it's the disgust issue, maybe you can see it as an indicator that, hey, there's something about beauty and beauty's relationship with art that will always be important. And yeah, there are instances and exceptions, and I know beauty is a loaded term, but I do think it's interesting that 100 years later, we're still not willing to let go of it. And the disgust factor continues to agitate us about this work. Maybe you're frustrated by the simplicity of its construction or the lack of craftsmanship. So perhaps that's an indicator that there's something about the act of creating that we don't want to let go of. Even in the age of machines and technology, there's something about handcrafted objects that assert something about our humanity or our unique creative capacities. I think there's also merit in wanting art to be a meaningful experience. One of the greatest things about art is its ability to transform and to shape the way we look at the world. We don't want art to be a pointer to nothingness. And so I think if one were hard-pressed to find value in Duchamp's Fountain, it may just be in the streams of thought and meaningful thought that flow out of it. No pun intended. So when you consider tough works like Duchamp's Fountain, I want to encourage you to pay attention to what you're reacting against. Because I believe these frustrations may be just as important at helping you appreciate and understand what art is than what it's not, okay? So that's it for today. Thanks for your attention, and we'll catch you next time.